Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity. I can confirm that the Magnuson Act definition of best available science and the lack of science on fish stocks are causing serious job losses in the district that I represent in North Carolina. A great example of this is NOAA's December the 2010 approval of Amendment 17B to the South Atlantic Snapper Grouper Plan. That amendment closed federal waters from 240 feet to 200 miles offshore from Florida through North Carolina to protect two fish, speckled hind and Warsaw grouper, for which there are no valid stock assessments. In fact, the last stock assessment on speckled hind was completed 11 years ago. The last stock assessment on Warsaw grouper was completed over 20 years ago. Imposing such a massive closure based on outdated science is not a good policy. It is also costing my constituents their jobs. The annual economic loss to fishermen in my district from Amendment 17B is over $1 million. I'm pleased that NOAA is helping to get some of these fishermen back to work, but serious damage has been done. This unnecessary situation is the result of Magnuson Act requirements to set annual catch limits on species determined to be undergoing overfishing based on best available science. NOAA has interpreted the Magnuson definition of best available science to mean any available science, regardless of how old it is and how sound it is. So in the case of Amendment 17B, even though the science was over 10 years old, it was used to produce a finding that the stocks are now undergoing overfishing. That finding triggered the Magnuson Act requirements for an annual catch limit, which the agency set at 0. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. Fishing communities around the country are suffering under similar circumstances. The fishermen that I talked to agree that at least 2 changes are necessary to fix the problem. First, Congress must improve the Magnuson Act definition of best available science. If the most recent stock assessment is more than 5 years old, it should not be considered as best available or used as a basis for management decisions. Second, we need more money for fisheries science. That's why it is so troubling that NOAA is robbing money from the science budget in order to ram their job-destroying catch shares agenda down the throats of fishermen. For fiscal year 2012, NOAA proposed to redirect $17.4 million from science to catch shares. This, again, is unacceptable. It is troubling to see NOAA take tens of millions of dollars in Saltonstall-Kennedy funds, which are required by law to be spent on fisheries research, and instead use them to fund NOAA operations. In fiscal year 2009 alone, NOAA used over 2/3 of its $108 million in Saltonstall-Kennedy revenue on operating expenses, leaving less than 1/3 for fisheries research grants. At the very least, this practice appears improper. It may be illegal. In the interest of transparency and accountability, I believe the Inspector General of the Commerce Department, or GAO, should open an investigation into NOAA's administration of Saltonstall-Kennedy funds. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank you and this committee again for this opportunity. As Mr. Micah said, it is time that we review what is sound science, and with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chairman thanks you. Mr. Frank, sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as he often does, Mr. Jones has put this case forward quite carefully and in a very well-documented fashion. I'm very pleased that we've worked together on a number of things. We have one particular bill especially relevant in the funding situation. We uncovered a pattern, the Inspector General did, and of the agency taking the money that they received from fines and using it quite improperly for their own benefit. So you had both an incentive for them to be levying fines more frequently and in larger amounts because they were the beneficiaries, and there were even some questionable expenditures. And it was money that could have gone to research. So one of the things we have is a bill that's before your committee that would take the fines and give them, in the rest of this fiscal year, 80% to the federal government, 20% to the states, but from the next fiscal year on, give them to the states to do the research. Because it is important that we have good research, and it is also important that we have independent research. It is important that we not simply have research that is done by the people who may have their own biases. So I recommend to you this legislation, which would make a significant amount of money available to do independent research, and it would convert the fines or the current system from an incentive to be excessively rigid. And I have to say, we have just all worked together to get an investigation of the way fishermen are treated. And I'm a little bit disappointed in some of my friends in the environmental community who kind of thought we were crying wolf. And I have to say, as a liberal, if immigrants, political protesters, or members of racial minorities had been abused by law enforcement in the same way that fishermen had, there would have been very loud protests. And I am sorry it took so long for some of my friends to understand that the right to fair law enforcement should not depend on other policy terms. And I think we are finally getting there. We've got a new head of law enforcement. But there are some other legislative changes that are necessary. The definition of science, and again, we want it to be good science. We want it to be science where there is some independence. We get a catch-22 where the Magnuson Act does say that they could revise the amount that people can catch if there's a showing that this is having terrible economic harm and you can justify it, but we've been told that they can only do that with data, but they can only do it with their own data, and we need to make that more flexible. There's a problem with the Magnuson Act definition also on the bycatch, as Mr. Micah talked about, where in multi-species fisheries, a shortage of one shuts down a whole fishery, and where you have this very rigid view about bycatch, so that fish that are caught are thrown overboard when they could be made available for people. And finally, we had a successful experiment, again, in a bipartisan way. We had the aid of Senator Snowe in the Senate, Mr. Jones, myself, and some others. We amended, it's particularly relevant for the New England area, the Canadian Boundary Act, because that had the requirement that's in the Magnuson Act that you have to rebuild the stocks within 10 years. 10 years is very arbitrary. I asked Dr. Lubchenko at NIMS, is there any justification for the 10 years? She said, well, the fact that's in the statute is the only justification. I asked her if she would then change the statute, and she, unfortunately, as her want, was uncooperative. But that 10 years is arbitrary. If we are making progress in restocking the fish, and it's going to take 12 or 13 years, but steady progress is coming, and maybe there was an incident not related to fishing that slowed it down, there isn't any reason why we couldn't have some flexibility there. And I say to my environmental friends, we're not talking here about permanently fouling the water or deteriorating air quality. We're talking about the number of fish we have, and that's not an absolute number. But what we did in the Canadian boundary issue was to give flexibility, so we don't have to live by the 10 years, and that's working very well, and it will mean there'll be enough fish. You know, we had a little debate at the end of last year, some members will recall, about lame duck legislation. Well, part of the problem is that the Magnuson Act, under which we are now acting, was a lame duck bill passed in 2006 in that lame duck session with a chairman who unfortunately had been defeated, and I think that we suffer from that. So this is an example of legislation to go through. The bill we have in terms of how you use the fines is an example, and I think we can, in fact, amend the Magnuson Act to be fully protective of fish stocks. I'm just last thing. The notion that fishermen want to fish stocks out of existence assumes that the current generation of fishermen who love this want to be the last fishermen ever. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I'd like to thank our colleagues for their interest in the important issue, and also for your time coming here today. It's a very busy time for Congress. I'm just going to open the dais for any specific question of the gentleman. Want to get them back to their duties as soon as possible, rather than have